Hello, my name is Peter Raymer. Today we're going to talk about how to create a simple list and details form in Microsoft Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. In a previous article and video, I showed you how to create a very basic form called a simple list form. That's the type of form with simply just a grid. But the next most common type of form is called a simple list and details form, and it's a little bit more complicated. In this type of form, we have a grid on the left-hand side that we can scroll up and down in. We can also filter the results, and then based on which record you select from the grid, we have many tabs and other pieces of information that we can show on the right-hand side. So I'm going to show you how you can build this, as well as teach you about form patterns. This will be a really important basis for some further lessons that I teach. So let's get started. So first of all, if you haven't followed this earlier lesson, I recommend you start here in how to create a form in D365. As part of it, I teach you the basics of creating the simple list form. I give you all the steps, and in the end, you're going to have a form that just has a basic grid in it and really nothing else. So it may look something as simple as this with just a couple columns. That's great for initial forms and getting started, but next we really do need to look at more complicated forms. So before I get into that, I want to talk a minute about form patterns. So here's a link to Microsoft's documentation around their different form patterns. Form patterns are basically design templates of how we should create different types of forms in D365. The point of this is so that even though we have simple forms and more complex forms and forms that have maybe a top grid and a bottom grid within D365, we want all those forms to look more or less the same for within the pattern that they're trying to achieve. And that way, even though there's thousands of forms in Microsoft Dynamics for 365 for finance and operations, all of those forms we want the user to be able to use really easily. If I've worked with another form that is a simple list and details type form, and then I open a second one, I'm already familiar with how it works. I understand that this is a grid on this side and that there's going to be fast tabs, and if I click on them, I can collapse or expand them. And so as long as we follow those same best practices, those same patterns, then it's going to be easier for developers to use any new custom forms that you create, as well as it'll be easier for developers to create them because Visual Studio has some tools to help you with that. So we'll get into that in just a second. So on this Microsoft documentation form, we can see all the different form patterns that are set up. You can even have your own custom form pattern if you like. What we're really going to be looking at is the simple list and details list grid in this example. There's also a couple other variants that'll show you a tabular grid and a tree. The form type that we created in the earlier lesson is just called a simple list. When I open that, it really just looks like this. It's got a grid and a filter and can have buttons across the top, but that's it. In this lesson, the simple list and details form pattern is a little bit more complicated. It can have this grid on the side, can have a quick filter to filter that grid, and then over on the right hand side we can have several tabs and groups. Underneath those tab pages can have fields in them or grids. We can even have a splitter in between, as well as buttons on the top. So really they fall into three different categories. or 3 different variants, I'll call them, of simple lists and details. One is called the list grid. This is the most common variant and should be your default. The tabular grid is very similar to the list grid, but it's for when you have more than 2 columns in this grid view. You may need to add a splitter to be able to drag this across. And then the last kind is a tree form where you've got a hierarchical tree. So real briefly, I want to show you what those look like. It's important for you to understand what they look like so that if you're a developer and you have this picture of the form in mind, you'll know that you need to use this form type when you're trying to build your form, or if maybe a different form type it would be better for what you're trying to create. So the most common example I like to always go to is this item groups form. It's under inventory management, setup, inventory, item groups, or you can search for it in the top bar. And it looks like this. This is an example of that list grid pattern that we're talking about. It's got our grid on the side and it can have tabs on the right side. There is actually no splitter because this really just has 2 columns in this setup. The next one is the tabular grid variant, and in this one we truly have a grid. It can have multiple tabs or multiple columns in here and is a good fit when you really need to potentially scroll. It's also got a splitter, which is this drag and drop here or drag tool to make it wider or smaller. And then the last kind, the tree variant, is going to look like this. It's where you're going to use a tree control, and then based on which node you select in here, you're going to see your tabs and related data for your record over here. Okay, so without further ado, let's kind of get started. We're going to build one that is a copy of the item group one, and so in the end it'll look basically like this. So this, I'm going to go back to Visual Studio. This is what we're going to end up with, and so this will take a few steps to get through, but I think this is really useful. Once you understand these few steps, they're the same for every one of these simple lists and details. You'll be an expert at creating these forms. So first of all, we need to create a new project. So if you haven't done that, go to File, New Project, select Finance and Operation, click Next, enter in a name of your project. I called mine Tutorial Simple List and Details Form, then click the Create button. I'll cancel out for now. Then make sure that you right-click on your project, select Properties, specify the model that you're working in. If you don't have a custom model created yet, I've got another video on how to create a model. I recommend you watch that first because you need to be creating all custom code within your own model. I've called mine Dynamics 365 Musings. So once that's set, then you can click OK and cancel out of here. So then the first thing we're going to do is create a new form. So if you right click on the project and select Add New Item, it'll bring us into this new item dialog. Make sure you select the Dynamics 365 Items node. That doesn't always get selected. Then scroll down and find the form type of object that we're going to create, and then let's give it a name. So I'm going to call mine Tutorial Simple List and Details List Grid 2. I gave it a really long name. You can make up whatever you want. I'm adding a 2 on the end because I've already created one, so I'll say Add. Now we get a very blank and empty form, and so we need to begin creating our controls. The first thing that I like to do even before I specify a design pattern is I want to add the data source that I'm looking to display on this form. So in this case, I'm going to actually search for invent item group, which is the name of the table that I want to display. In your case, you're most likely going to have your own custom table that you're going to want to add to your new form, but I'm picking an existing table just because I know everyone will have this table. It's part of the standard product and you can follow along for this tutorial. But in your case, feel free to drag your own table into the data source. So once you find it, just drag it over on top of this data source node and let it go, and it'll create that new data source node. That's the easiest way to add this data source. Now that we've added this data source, we want to set the design pattern, and this is going to allow Visual Studio to help us out going forward. So if you right click on this design node and then select apply pattern, it's going to show us all the different form design patterns that are within the system, including a custom one if none of them meet the criteria. But in this case, we're going to pick the simple list and details list grid. So I'll go ahead and select that. And immediately you'll notice this window down below switches to the pattern tab. And the pattern tab is just a helpful tool that makes it so Visual Studio can let us know what are all the required objects, the required form controls needed to make this form follow this pattern. And so this is extremely helpful. It means that we don't constantly have to try to figure this out from a blog article or anything else. We can use this guide to help us out. That said, it's still really helpful to have a blog article like this one or a video that you can follow along. Additionally, I'll say at this point, it's very helpful to use an example when you're trying to build these that you can look off of. So if I actually look up the invent item group form, it's down here. I've already kind of searched for it. You can right click, say open design, and it'll open the existing design for this type of form that I know uses this design pattern. And then I can look at all the different controls that it has. I can even take a screenshot, move this to another monitor if I need to for reference, or dock it into a different window, and then really follow along to make sure that I have all of these core components. For now, I'll tell you each of the main components that we need, and we'll go through them, but I think it's extremely useful to just use an example and copy it. To begin with, we really have 4 nodes that we need to start with, which is what our design pattern's kind of showing us. We need to have this ActionPane, which is where our buttons go up top. The next thing is we need a grid container group. You can name it whatever you want. It doesn't have to be called grid container, but it needs to be a group control, and that's going to contain our grid and other components that show up on the left side of the form. Then we're going to have our details header group, which is going to show us just a few fields at the very top, like our unique identifier name. And then lastly, we're going to have a tab, and that tab's going to contain one or more tabs underneath it that can contain fields or grids. And so it's just helpful, even before we get started, to realize a simple list and details form is really just broken into these 4 pieces. And so let's start with that, and then we'll add the details here in a second. So if I come back here, I can see my design pattern's already telling us about those 4 pieces we need. So I'm going to say, I can see here I need an ActionPane. What's in the parentheses is the type of control that I need to add. So I'm going to right click on the design node, select new, and then look for ActionPane here, which I think it's all the way up top here. ActionPane. Okay, got a new ActionPane. You can rename this if you'd like. Sometimes I like to get rid of the 1 on the end, but for now we'll just leave it. Next, if I click on my design node, I can see that requirement has been met. I've created that record. The next thing is I need a group. Here they call it a navigation list group. In this case, we're going to call it our grid container. And so if I right click on the design node again, say new, and then find group. It's going to create a new group. I'm going to rename it by either clicking here, or you can right click, select properties, and this properties window will pop up, and you can go to the name property, and then we're just going to call this grid container. That way it matches our example, but the name really doesn't matter. But I recommend you follow along. Notice right now it's saying I don't have a pattern specified. That's okay. Let's just ignore that, and you'll see that that kind of goes away in a second. So if I click back on our design, the system's a little confused. It doesn't quite know which group is which, but we just know we need two groups. So let's go and click and create a second group. So I'm going to right click on the design node again, select new, select group, and then this time I'm going to call this group DetailsHeader. And you'll actually notice this one kind of went away. It's no longer looking for a pattern type because it kind of recognizes this as that first group. And then now we've got this second group, which is going to represent the right side of our form. So I'm going to next right click on this second group and say apply pattern field and field groups, just because that's the type of data we're going to put in here. All right, the last thing that I need to create, if I click back on our design node and look at this pattern node, is I need a details tab, or a tab control, as you can see inside these parentheses. So I'm going to right click, say new, and then scroll down and find the tab control. And I'm going to rename this one tab, just to be consistent and match what we're seeing in Invent Item Group. All right, now if I click back, I can, on our design node, I can see that we've got our initial nodes created correctly, but there's a couple warnings. We don't have all the sub objects created correctly. So let's go ahead and do that next. So let's start first with this grid container. This grid container, again, is the left side of our form. So it's going to be this grid part of our form with our quick filter up top. So let's get started on making that component. To do that, let's right click and say new. And the first thing we need is a quick filter. Quick filter is that filter that appears right above the grid and allows you to really quickly filter the grid. I'll leave that alone for now. Now I'm going to right click on the grid container again, and you'll notice when I do click on the grid container, it does show me each of the components I need, which is really nice. So it shows I'm just missing a grid here. So I'm going to right click, say new, grid, and it'll add a new grid to this group. Now I need to add a couple fields to my grid, otherwise the grid won't show anything. So to add the fields, the easiest way to do it is to add them from the data source and just drag and drop them. So I'm going to expand my Invent Item Group data source. I'm going to expand my fields. And then what you're really looking for here is your main unique identifier. So in this case, the main unique identifier on this table is called Item Group ID. I'm going to drag this field onto the grid and let go, and it'll add a new string control. And then as a second field, usually there's a name or description field, something that's a little bit longer, a little bit more descriptive of the data that's on that record. You're going to want to grab that record if it exists and drag it onto the grid as well. So now I've got the grid, or I've got the ID and the name, and we're doing pretty good. Now I need to go back to the quick filter and make sure that I finish setting it up. A quick filter requires it to point at a grid control and give a default column. So when I select it, I can right click properties, or if I've already got the properties window open, I'm going to go here. The first property I need to set is called the placeholder. I'm sorry, not the placeholder text, the target control. So if I select that property and click the drop down, I can select the only grid on my form right now, which is called the form grid control. In your case, you want to specify whatever grid is right here. It might be named something else, but just enter that in, and then you should be set there. The next property I want to pick is what field, what column in this grid should it by default filter on. If someone were to type in real quickly and hit enter, which field should it filter on? And you're going to want to set that to the unique identifier as a best practice. So in this case, the control is called invent item group ID. Yours will be named something differently, but you can select it right here. Now I've finished setting up my quick filter, I've set up my grid, and so really I'm done with this grid container. I can validate that by clicking on the grid container, going to this pattern tab, and seeing that I've got no red text here. It thinks that I'm done with this component. So I'll collapse that for now, just to kind of mark that as done. And then if I click back on our design node, I can still see I've got an issue with this tab page. But before I do that, I actually need to go back to this details header. This details header, even though it's not saying I have an issue, basically I need to add fields to this group to show just like it shows up in the top right here, this field and this field right here. Basically, these two fields should be the duplicate of whatever record you've selected over here. Don't ask me exactly why we're having the same information twice. Maybe it's so if this is cut short or too small that it's going to show, or maybe if the name's really long. But either way, it's a best practice of this design that we have these two fields every single time up here on this right side as well. So let's go ahead and grab those two fields from our data source. I'll drag the item group into this group, our details header group, and then I'll grab the name into our group as well. Great, now I've added those components. I'm done with the details header. Lastly, I need to deal with this tab. And this tab is where we have more freedom. So far, everything's been really defined for us, what's needed in this form pattern. Whereas with the tab, we can actually add one or many tab pages. Those tab pages can have field groups and fields on them, or they can have grids on them coming from a different data source, a lot of different things. So this is where we have more choice in our design. For now, a tab must have a tab page, as I can see here. So I need to right click on my tab, and then the only option I have for a tab is a new tab page. So I'll click that. On the tab page, I'm going to real quickly give it a caption and just enter in general, and that'll make sure that that text shows on this particular tab page. The next thing I need to do is I'm going to right click and say new group, and it's just more of a best practice that we put any of these fields within a group. And then lastly, I can add whatever data I want onto this tab page. So this is just an example, so I'm just going to pick some different random ones. Maybe I'll add this price field, and I'll add, I don't know, this enable field and this field. It doesn't really matter because this is an example. In your case, you're going to add whatever fields from your data make sense. And if you've got a table with a lot of different fields, you may split those up between different tab pages to make it a little bit more organized and easier to work with. I'll leave that up to you. So that's really it. Now that we've completed that, I can go back to the design node, validate that I've done everything that I need to, that nothing's red. Things, being red indicate that there's a problem, but there still might be more issues, more things that you've missed, but this is a good initial check to see have you done the bare minimum of meeting the design requirements. All right, there's a couple more things we need to do to be able to see this and show it. First, let's click the design node, right-click properties if you haven't already to see the properties window. There's a few properties that we always want to set on a form, and there's a lot more, but let's just start with these few. So the caption is the text we want to see. So I'm going to just call this tutorial simple list and details and hit enter. We could change this to a label, but I'll leave that as is for now. The data source, we always want to set it to the primary data source. So in this case, I only have one data source. It's called invent item group, so I'll set it there. And then lastly, there's a title data source. I want to set that to my invent item group as well. Okay, I'll hit save. Now, right before I finish and build this, in order to see this on in a browser, I need a menu item that points to this form, and I need to add that menu item to a menu. So if you need real specific instructions for that, I definitely recommend you check out this other blog article I have of how to create a menu item in D365. I guess I can search for that. You can just use the search here. And how to create menu items in D365 will walk you through each one of those steps. But let's do it real quickly here. So I'm going to right click on my project, say add new item. I'm going to select a display menu item. That's the correct type. I'm going to call this tutorial simple list and details list grid 2 so that it matches the same as my form. It's kind of a best practice. It'll open up and select the node automatically. If not, right click on it, say open, and make sure you select the node. Then you're going to look at the properties. If you don't see the properties, right click properties. Then select this object and type in the name of your form. So in my case, tutorial simple list and details list grid 2. And then the other thing is we need a label. So I'm just going to call this one tutorial simple list and details, and I'm going to use the word number 2. Normally I would never use a 2 in a title like this, but just to help differentiate it. Okay, so I've set my form that I want it to open. I want to give it a label. The last thing I need to do is make sure that this menu item, which is those blue links you see, are actually on a menu. So the menus, if I clear out this, are all under user interface and under menus. I'm not actually able to modify any base Microsoft ones directly. I need to create an extension. So normally you would right click and say create extension. I've actually already done that, so I'm going to come to my menu extensions and find the one that I've already created and right click and open designer. I also want to add this to my project, which I've already done. That way when I compile this project, it picks up my change. Okay, couple more things. I've added a submenu already for tutorials, but if I wanted to do that, I could always say new submenu. And then I could give that submenu a label, call it tutorials. Then I need to add my display menu item to this submenu by dragging it onto that node. And now I've got a second one here that lines up there. Looks like I missed an S in the way I named this one, but that's okay. Doesn't really matter. So finally I can actually build this solution and then see what it looks like. So I'll build this a second and then I'll fast forward the video. Okay, I've finished my build. I've gone back to my browser and I've hit reload, which is required after you do a build within Visual Studio. Now I can come to the menu. In my case, I added it to the accounts receivable menu. And then if I scroll over to the end and go to tutorials, I can see the form that I just created and the label. And if I click on that, it'll actually load the form here. And so I can see, sure enough, I get a grid with a quick filter that shows me the item ID, or the invent group, I should say, and name from the item group table, and then I see the few fields that I added to this fast tab that's called General right here. So that's it. Now you know how to create a simple list and details form in Microsoft Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. This is extremely useful as this form is really common. Also, you learned how to apply those form patterns and use those form patterns within Visual Studio to make sure that you've added all of the necessary controls. You can use this same functionality in creating any of the other many types of form patterns that Microsoft has. You can always look up the different form patterns, look how the form is displayed, see if it's a good fit for what you're trying to build, and then apply that form pattern within Visual Studio and make sure you're adding all those same controls as well. I also recommend you look at an example form within Visual Studio and then look at all those same nodes. So hopefully you learned something new today. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you watching. If you liked the video, click the like button. I also invite you to push the subscribe button as well. If there's other topics you would like to see a video on, please post in the comments and I'll see what I can do. I hope you learned something new today. Thank you.